Our next speaker is a reminder to me that I've got to come to Washington more often. When I was last here, she was Director of Domestic Social Development for the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, but she is now Associate Director for Government Affairs at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, and she'll bring some of this conversation down to some specific issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg. Good morning, everyone. It is a real honor to be back here and to be with this esteemed panel. We're passing out some handouts because, as Greg said, I'm now with the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, and we have a law that we cannot go anywhere without charts or graphs. So you won't be able to read all the detail of numbers on here, but that's not the point. The point of this is to see some general trends and to see the big picture. When Michael Sean invited me to participate on this panel, he asked me to apply what the panelists have said about Catholic social teaching and Catholic teaching in general and libertarianism, and to apply it to what Congress is working on. And I thought, great, that won't take long. But one thing that Congress does do every year is consider the budget, which is a really critical part of our national debate right now. How do we allocate our resources? And the budget debate, I find, is really a proxy debate for a broader conversation our nation has been having over the last many years of what is the proper role and scope of government. And I think that's where we get into a bit of how this whole today came together, because we do see certainly a trend towards this libertarian philosophical approach. So on Mike Gerson, who's a great columnist in the Washington Post, a former speechwriter for President George W. Bush, wrote back in February in a column he had entitled "Republicans Deal with the Tea Party Hangover." As Catholics, we are all familiar with that is, right? A hangover. And he finished his column by saying, "There are very few libertarians after hurricanes." And so I thought that was really insightful, and that, you know, we can all say, oh, I don't need government in my life. Government just is a problem. I want to get government out of my life, until, of course, we find that we need government. And if we look at that first slide, this is the chart of what our federal spending was for last fiscal year in 2013. That pie represents the division of about $3 trillion. And at this building over here that we can see from the window, the beautiful frame division of the Capitol, even there, $3 trillion is a decent amount of money. And the way that we divide that up, if you look at the yellow and orange pies there, that is our non-defense, or that is our discretionary programs. By discretionary, we don't mean things that we may or may not want to fund this year, but rather discretionary, and that they need to be allocated or appropriated every year by Congress. The lighter piece of pie, we'll call that lemon meringue for purposes of this discussion, is defense. And that's what we spend in our defense. It would include health care for our troops. It includes their income. It also includes our weapons systems and so on. I will not even begin with Marianne Kisimana Love sitting in front of me going into much more detail on that. But, and both libertarians would say that that is something that is the proper role of government and we should fund. It is also something that Catholic teaching would support, that we fund a good defense to protect ourselves. So that is not really at debate of whether or not it should exist. The question is how much of our resources do we put into that? If you look at the darker piece of pie, we'll call that pumpkin pie, that is the non-defense discretionary. That is what I was talking about earlier. And that includes a lot of low-income programs. It includes international foreign assistance. It includes things like Head Start. It also includes things, my guess is you have already interacted with something today that was funded through non-defense discretionary programs. I know that when I entered the building, got into the elevator, I didn't worry about, oh my gosh, is this thing going to plummet to the basement? Because I assumed it had been inspected, it was cared for, someone had taken care of it. When I ate breakfast this morning, I didn't worry about my food being tainted. I trusted that the coffee had come through customs and had been inspected. So all of us, no matter low income or upper income, interact with these non-defense discretionary programs every day. We have about a third of this, which is the darker blue pieces of pie, that primarily go towards the elderly in both income support, Social Security, and healthcare, Medicare. And then the lighter pieces of pie, about a third of our budget, is allocated for the very poor, for children, and the disabled through other entitlement programs such as SNAP or food stamps, TANA for welfare cash payments, or Medicaid and CHIP programs, healthcare for the poor, children, and disabled. So that's essentially how we divide up our budget. Now, the pieces are getting smaller, and also the size of the pie is actually shrinking. If you look at the next slide there, this is what I called our road to disinvestment. It is how we're spending that non-defense discretionary spending is actually set to fall to historical lows. What we hear a lot in the rhetoric and cable news shows is that our spending is out of control, the federal government is wildly growing. But in fact, if you look at that trend there, the peak right around 2010, of course, is where the recession was. We had a shrinking GDP. So the non-defense discretionary was taking up a little bit more of the GDP. Plus, we had the Stimulus Act, the ARA bill. But if you look at where that downward slope continues to where we are today, where the orange line picks up, that's where sequestration was put into effect. And sequestration was our fiscal policy of austerity that did non-discriminatory across-the-board cuts and programs in both in defense and non-defense spending. There, as you'll recall, last year, Budget Committee Chairman Ryan in the House and Chairwoman Patty Murray in the Senate reached a deal to stop the sequestration. We still have the budget caps, but they reached a budget deal, so we wouldn't have those across-the-board cuts. But that expires next year. And so we will again start that budget debate as we head into 2016. The next slide I have there is what the House passed budget resolution looked like this year. And this is also referred to as the Ryan budget, although we don't refer to that way in this room, do we? But it is nonetheless is where it is not going to be in law. It's not going to be the budget that will go into effect for fiscal year 15. But I thought because a lot of the ideas in this budget have really been what sparked this whole conversation about how we look at libertarianism and how that applies to Catholic social teaching, I thought it was worth including. And you can see where 69% of the cuts in that budget come directly from programs that are for low or moderate income people. Many of those programs are things like food stamps, Medicaid, some Medicare programs, and Pell Grants. And so the idea in the rhetoric around this is, well, this will put money back in the pockets of workers and families so they can best decide how to spend it. And that, of course, would completely negate all of what's been said this morning about us being in relationship with one another, about having our society reflect the image of God, and that the investments that we put are really for the common good for all that we share. Now, one of the responses to budget proposals like this that emerged from that in the faith community, and particularly the Christian community, is a coalition called the Circle of Protection. And there are many people in this room, including John Carr, who were instrumental in creating that. And the Catholic bishops were the first to sign on to the Circle of Protection. And it really brings together Christians of all stripes. You have in the Circle of Protection the National Association of Evangelicals, the Salvation Army, other Christian organizations and denominations that would be considered more conservative, as well as more progressive organizations and denominations that would be considered, a little bit on the more liberal side, all agreeing that when we put together our budget, it really should reflect our commitment to the common good and protect and putting a circle around those most in need, not only in our own country, but around the world. If you're not familiar with the Circle of Protection, I encourage you to go to circleofprotection.us and learn more about that. So the other argument that we hear a lot from libertarians is, well, the safety programs, the safety net doesn't work. We've invested all this money in the war on poverty, and we still have poverty. We have a lot of waste, fraud, and abuse. This next chart shows that really, in fact, these programs do work. And today, the safety net today actually cuts poverty nearly in half as if we did not have the safety net programs. So if we were to eliminate Medicaid, if we were to eliminate food stamps, our poverty rate in the United States would actually be twice as high as what it is today. It's not to say that we shouldn't continue to work and improve, and as Mary said, we all hands on deck, but nonetheless, we have had a success with the war on poverty. Now, this next chart is not from the Center on Budget and Poverty, Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, because it's cute and clever, but it's actually from Bread for the World here, and it shows 24 bags of groceries. And another argument we hear a lot from libertarians is, well, caring for the poor should be the work of the church. The church should do this. And I heard a statistic at one point that if you were to eliminate all the outreach and low-income programs to the poor that the government did and put it on the backs of the religious community, each church, mosque, and synagogue would have to raise their budgets by $100,000 each year, every year, to fill that need. I've yet to meet a pastor who's willing to raise an additional $100,000 a year, every year, to meet that. So Mike Consul in the Democracy Journal this year argued that the state establishes a baseline of equality and solidarity so that charity can enhance the state. Safety net allows charity to target aid and nimbly respond to need. Human dignity therefore entitles people to an existence minimum, and the state is best situated to do that. And Niebuhr wrote Immoral Man and Immoral Society recently in 1932, since we're talking about church teaching. 1932 is a recent event here. Philanthropy combines genuine pity with the display of power, and that latter element explains why the privileged are more inclined to be generous than to grant social justice. So by having the state, having the government also be a partner in reducing poverty and caring for the need and meeting the needs of the common good, many of those are ways of addressing the systemic injustices. Now, if you look at these bags of groceries, this is looking at what 1 in 24 bags of food assistance comes from a charitable organization, and federal nutrition programs provide the rest. And so looking at those previous statements, we can say it's important to have that one bag of food, though, even though it is a small piece of the assistance. It allows that nimbleness. It allows us as Catholics to be who we are, to live out the gospel. It allows us to decide, while many of the federal nutrition programs exclude undocumented immigrants, we see the undocumented immigrant as Jesus. We see the undocumented immigrant as our brother and sister, and therefore are compelled to feed them. And so that we're able to do that regardless of what the rules are in a federal nutrition program. It allows us to feed that family who's struggling, who maybe makes just a little bit above what the cutoff would be for food stamps, for example. We can say that that family is still human beings and, again, our neighbors, and we must feed them. Right now, we have a debate going on during the appropriations process for the agricultural spending bill about children's nutrition programs and whether or not to maintain the strong, healthy nutrition standards in the school breakfast and lunch programs. Schools every day feed 30 million children in our country. 20 to 25 million of those children receive free and reduced price lunch. And someone earlier in the panel said we can't necessarily go into these broader debates and saying, well, we're Catholic, therefore, here's what we're all going to do. We live in a pluralistic society. So even setting aside Catholic teaching and what that means, implications on human dignity, the new research coming out on the impacts of children living in poverty and what it does, long-term health effects, long-term effects on brain development, on health outcomes for the rest of their lives, makes it critical and important for all of us to assure those 30 million children get nutritious meals every day. And then lastly, you'll see these charts here. The first one, the largest graph bar, is taxes. So the first chart that I showed you of $3 trillion is the $3 trillion we collect from revenues and that we disperse back out. It does not include the money and that goes back to people through our tax policies, through our tax expenditures. And so you can see tax expenditures are very costly. Much of the tax expenditures do go to higher income households, but that's not all. We have been, the Bishops' Conference and the Catholic community have long been supporters of the refundable earned income tax credit and child tax credits. Those are important tax policies that help families who are working and still struggling to have additional income. But this also includes the mortgage interest deductions, deductions for state income tax. It also includes the charitable deduction. I'm not here arguing that we get rid of the charitable deduction, just on the record, is that being picked up? But to say that when we look at how we spend our money and we don't look at the other side of the ledger of how we bring in money and what kind of revenues we have, that's missing a whole big piece of the puzzle. And so I think as we look going forward, I mean, every year we're deciding how do we divide up this $3 trillion, which is a very critical debate, and I think that this whole discussion today has strong implications for. It's also looking forward to 2016 when we have to have a new budget agreement or otherwise go back to sequestration. And it also looks forward to and implications for debate I think our country has to have and seems to want to have is on tax reform. I don't really see that playing out until after the next presidential election, so probably not until 2017. But nonetheless, I think we need to start having the conversation now because we're a far way away from where we need to be in having that tax reform debate and what it means for the common good and for the benefit of everyone in our nation. So with that, we'll turn it over for questions.